Welcome to this webinar in support of Rabbit Awareness Week, kindly sponsored by Supreme Pet Foods. My name is Molly Varga Smith, and as well as being the veterinary advisor in the UK for Supreme Pet Foods, I am a full-time exotic animal clinician with a very heavy and diverse rabbit caseload. So I'm lucky enough to see a lot of rabbits and a lot of rabbit owners every day. So what I want to talk about today is a variety of topics related to how we feed our rabbits. I'm hoping that this will give you some suggestions, some top tips that will be useful along the way. But before we get into all that, I'd like to remind everybody that actually there are many ways to get your rabbit to eat a good diet. And so I don't want this to be a very prescriptive webinar. I hope that I can illustrate what I mean by getting you to understand some of the underlying concepts of what rabbits need and how we can access that, and what it can look like for you with your rabbit patient, your rabbit companion. And there are a lot of ways that we can absolutely do a good job with this. So I think the first thing is that it's important to understand the ingredients in the diet. I think it's important to understand how rabbits have evolved and how diet and function of the rabbit body are very, very intimately linked, perhaps more so than some other species. I'd like to discuss again the microbiome, and again we're hearing a lot about the microbiome in terms of human health at the moment, so we'll look at its importance for rabbits and again how we can perhaps manipulate it. We'll talk about what happens to dietary requirements as the rabbit changes age, whether the lifestyle is altered, and to a degree we'll look at what we can do with the diet to support animals that have different medical conditions. And finally, we'll look at food in terms of the rabbit in its larger environment, how we can use it to encourage exercise and how we can use it as an enrichment tool to allow rabbit companions either in the practice or within the home to demonstrate normal movement and normal behaviour. So food is not simply just what these animals eat. There are far wider implications in terms of this. So what actually should rabbits eat? So I think there are a wide variety of resources, particularly now available on the internet, and I would definitely avoid forums, which is really opinion based, and go for some fact-based resources, and there's a variety here. Most of these are generally largely in agreement. And what should rabbits eat? We should feed rabbits an ad lib amount of hay, as much as they want of a good quality hay. They should have ad lib fresh water. Absolutely, don't forget that water is a key component of any animal's diet. Typically, we advocate feeding a small amount of good quality pellets, and as well as that, a variety of fresh greens daily. Now, as I say, there is general agreement from most sources about this. However, there are always going to be arguments and some controversies. And I'd like to take the bull by the horns, really, and discuss some of the controversial subjects surrounding feeding rabbits early on, so that we can be really clear about where we're positioned, but also actually the truth behind these controversies. And the first thing is about feeding muesli. Now, I think muesli has been absolutely vilified in terms of how we feed rabbits or any small pets in particular. I'm going to flip this on its head for a moment, because most brands of muesli, unless you are actually formulating your own, are actually nutritionally balanced if you look at the whole diet. So this means that if you're going to feed muesli to a rabbit or another small pet, then that rabbit needs to accept and eat all of the components of the diet as produced in order for that diet to be nutritionally balanced. Now, because there are, rabbits, like any other animal, will choose the things that it likes the most. The texture, the colour, the taste is variable between the components of the diet. There are certainly going to be bits of the diet that each animal has a preference for. So as veterinary staff or as pet owners, we do need to understand, if you're going to feed muesli, the animal needs to take the whole diet, which means that when it's skimmed off its preferred bits, the rest of it needs to be eaten before anything more is fed. Now, this is a key issue with muesli type diets, and if you're going to feed muesli, we should look upon it as a small proportion of the diet that is fed in that manner. It is fed appropriately. And if we can't do that, or we have an animal that doesn't accept it, then muesli is not an appropriate part of that animal's diet. And we need to manipulate things so that we can feed that animal so that it's got something nutritionally appropriate. And this is where pellets come in, because pellets very typically are nutritionally balanced. So what that means is for every mouthful of pellets, that rabbit is getting a nutritionally balanced intake. So it allows us to make feeding rabbits that much easier. So if you're feeding muesli and you're doing it right, fair enough. If not, let's move to pellets and make life a little bit more simple for ourselves. And if we're looking at pellets or kibble, then, as I said, they're all nutritionally balanced, but we need to consider some of the other controversies that we get asked about very regularly when we're talking about pet food, and that is the ingredients of the pellets. And one good example of this is the inclusion of alfalfa in pellets. Now, we very widely do not advocate feeding rabbits on alfalfa hay because of its calcium content. However, when we're producing pellets and we need a good source of calcium, then adding alfalfa to provide that controlled level of calcium is an excellent way to achieve a need for that pellet. So alfalfa in pellets, absolutely appropriate. Alfalfa hay as a sole hay in the diet, not appropriate for most rabbits. So as I say, there are many things that we can discuss in terms of that, but these are two common things that we get discussed very regularly. So let's look at hay in and of itself. So hay is a very natural product, and what that means is that its nutritional content varies, and it typically varies with season, it varies with geographic location, it varies with weather between year on year, as well as different species or varieties of grass that are used and included within it. And it's supposed to be a variable feast, if you like. And in the wild, this is what rabbits would ordinarily eat. So from that perspective, we can ride with that nutritional variability a little bit. And again, as soon as we're talking about getting hay that is packaged, that variability perhaps is reduced, because we certainly do look at the nutrient content of those packaged diets. So there are many types of hay available, and these can range from people who buy hay bales at the local farm to the small dust extracted plastic single grass type packs that you can get at pet shops. Increasingly, actually, there's a lot of hay available online as well, and you can get an absolute vast variety of types. So from that perspective, the sorts of hay that we typically see are things like Timothy hay, which Timothy grass is a specific variety of grass. Meadow hay tends to be a mixture of grass varieties. Orchard hay, again, similar but slightly varying grass varieties. And in general, what you actually want is hay that is fibrous and not too high in protein or calcium. So you want hay that is almost fairly ordinary. And when you're choosing hay, what you need to do is to look for hay that smells fresh, hay that is not dusty, hay that doesn't have too many sharp points or too many seed heads. And realistically, it should smell of, cut grass, that type of smell. And I think, you can be very confident that fresh smelling hay is going to be good for your rabbit. It might be worth considering at this point other products, and we'll come to some of these again later on in the webinar. And I think the first thing is that a lot of owners do get very worried when their rabbits won't eat hay. And in terms of that, I think it can be concerning because you worry about teeth, you worry about gut health. So what can we do? So we can actually say, right, well, my rabbit won't eat hay. Let's try grass. And freshly picked grass, not grass clippings, can actually be a useful part of the diet. Grass is the forerunner of hay, and essentially it will grind your rabbit's teeth down just as well as hay does. So if your rabbit is struggling with hay because it's a little bit too hard or a little bit too fibrous, then grass could be a good option. Other options could be other dried forage or browse, and there are a lot of commercial products now that contain dandelion root, dandelion leaves, dried rose leaves, all sorts of amazing ingredients. And again, these can be very well accepted by rabbits that perhaps are struggling a little bit more with hay, or are not used to eating hay, or are averse to trying it. So again, there's a lot of options out there, and we can also look at some of the preserved grasses, such as products like ready grass, which again can be a good stepping stone to getting these guys to eat proper hay. So pellets, nuggets and muesli, as I said, most people that work with rabbits and own rabbits use the pellets or nuggets as a small core of the diet to make certain that we don't have any nutritional deficiencies. So it's an easy way to be certain that we have sufficient vitamin D, for example, within the diet, that we have sufficient minerals that may be restricted in hay. And again, it should only be a small proportion of the diet, used, as I say, as a core or a basis so that we don't have any issues. And particularly, we do need to make certain that how much we feed is controlled. So for most of these products, what we're looking at is about 25 grams per kilo per day at the most. Now, this could look like an egg cupful or a tablespoonful, with some of the less densely packed pellets. The volume would be far greater, although the weight would remain the same. So the type of pellet certainly does matter when we're looking at the volume versus the weight to feed. I think also we need to be aware of how these pellets are stored. And again, generally, you'd want them stored in an airtight bag or container away from direct sunlight and direct heat, and ideally you'd want to utilize these products within the date stated on the packaging, just so that we don't get any issues with the fat content or free radical production or anything like that for products that are kept well past their sell-by date. So, green leafy vegetables. So, why do we need to feed vegetables at all if we've got hay and we've got pellets? Well, to be fair, actually, if you think about rabbits in the wild, rabbits are starting to be born sort of in the spring, certainly by this time of year when rabbits are starting to be weaned in the wild. They've got access to all sorts of rapidly growing leaves and vegetable products, and so it's a very natural thing for us to feed to rabbits, and it improves variety, it is enriching for them, and it is, as I say, a good part of the natural diet. There are a variety of vegetables that are suitable, and actually leafy greens, for example, things like rocket, spring greens, curly kale, dandelion leaves, carrot tops are all very suitable indeed. There are some vegetables that we should be a little bit more cautious with. So brassicas such as broccoli and cauliflower, they can cause a little bit more gas production, and that can cause discomfort to rabbits. Spinach contains oxalates as well as a lot of calcium. So for some rabbits, a diet that is very high in spinach can predispose to bladder sludge. This isn't to say that we shouldn't feed spinach as part of a variety of vegetables on occasions, but it's to be aware that we shouldn't be relying only on spinach. Other things like carrots, they can be fed on occasion or potentially as a treat. Carrots are actually quite high in starch, so they can be one cause of rabbits not eating their cicatrose very well. And in the wild, you don't see rabbits digging for carrots. They eat the carrot tops and they leave the tubers alone. So again, perhaps not a daily treat for a rabbit. And things like green beans, again, quite high in protein. They can cause gas buildup in the gut. So as a treat, yes, or on occasion, absolutely, but not to form a solid basis within the diet. I'm going to talk about treats in more detail shortly, but there are a variety of fresh things that we can consider. So apples, berries such as raspberries or strawberries, or even pieces of cucumber can all be perceived as treats. They're nutritionally suitable. They're something that we can, include in the diet on occasion. This is not a daily happening. We do need to remember, however, that there are certain things that we should never feed to rabbits. And so any plant that grows from a bulb, for example, so daffodils, that type of thing, any allium, so leeks, onions, or chives, we should avoid rhubarb because of the fact that it contains oxalates. We should avoid iceberg lettuce. And it should go without saying that dairy, meat, chocolate, and things like avocado and citrus are not suitable as part of a rabbit diet, even as treats. So it's worthwhile being aware of this. We are going to talk about foraging in a moment, but again, those of you that do get out and forage, absolutely, foraged vegetation will have a much more natural nutritional content for a rabbit compared to supermarket products. Supermarket products are grown and bred for human consumption, which means they tend to be higher in water, they tend to be higher in sugar, they tend to be slightly lower in fibre, whereas the wild counterparts aren't. They are much lower in sugar, they're much higher in fibre and lower in water content. So this can make the difference between being quite reliant on pellets versus needing them a little bit less. So foraging, absolutely, I would encourage people if they're able to go out and forage, but we certainly need to be aware of what we're choosing and what we're picking. So I would very much encourage owners to consider foraging for things like dandelion leaves, plantain, herb robert, all sorts of bramble leaves. That type of thing can be a really excellent component in your rabbit's diet, and again, it gets you out and about into the fresh air yourself. But remember that you do need to identify what you're foraging accurately. If you are on somebody's land, you do need to have permission also to be there, and you do need to be aware of things like pollution from roads, pesticides, and also potentially contamination from byproducts from other animals. So in terms of foraging, it is always about being sensible. Now, there are various things that are around and about that we should try and avoid. So things like rhododendron, lupins and foxgloves, things like yew, lily of the valley, and the nightshade, so both deadly and woody nightshade. None of these are going to be very good for your rabbits. And so therefore you need to make certain that you can identify these accurately, as well as being able to avoid them so that everybody is, safe in terms of that. With a lot of foraged food, what many of my rabbit owners do actually is they gather a lot of forage, which they then dry themselves and can use in the longer term in subsequent days, weeks or months. So again, it's a really nice way to supplement a rabbit's diet, and it can be, as I say, a very useful addition to our armory, if you like, of how we feed these guys. So we mentioned houseplants briefly, and I did want to sort of put some clarity surrounding that. Now, this is not to say that we advocate whatsoever feeding houseplants to rabbits, and I would advise that you keep your rabbits and your houseplants as separate as possible. Now, I think there's always that nugget of, worry as soon as a rabbit eats something that we perceive that it shouldn't do. So what I've included here is a list of houseplants that we need to be less concerned about. It's a reasonably safe list. This is not to suggest that I think it's okay for your rabbits to go nuts and eat these plants on a daily basis. However, it is just to provide a little bit of insight and reassurance. For example, if your rabbit does eat any of these, that we are less likely to have an issue than perhaps if it eats something that isn't on that list, for example, things like spider plants, where they can cause concern. So absolutely, let's be clear, rabbits and houseplants are not safe bedfellows. So what about treats? So we touched upon this a few minutes ago, and I want to take a step back and actually think about why we might want to give treats to our rabbits. And certainly as veterinary professionals, we might use treat foods to encourage an animal when, you know, things are happening to it that may be more scary. But certainly it's a very, very basic human need to give something, and as I say, it quite often is a food product, to a being that is within your life, to cause that being pleasure, to bring pleasure to that animal. And I think it's a nice thing, it's a very bonding experience. So I would absolutely never say don't give treats. Absolutely give all of the treats, but let's be mindful about how we do it, because actually, you know, when we have these animals in our workspace or within our home space, it doesn't need to be a negative experience. In fact, we should look and try to make it a much more positive experience. So treats are very, very useful, as I say, to bond the rabbit to you and to gain trust, to promote behaviours. So, for example, toilet training behaviours, those sorts of things. And as I said, we can use some natural products. So things like apples, strawberries, cucumber are all suitable treats. And treats should be given sometimes, not all the time. They shouldn't form the basis of the diet. And we should also remember that any treat should be looked at compared to the rest of the diet. So, for example, an animal that is perhaps a little bit overweight, the energy contained within the treats should be included within the energy level that you're trying to feed that animal per day. We can also look at commercial treats, and there are, again, a wide variety of very, very good and very useful and very healthy commercial treats available. And these, again, I would completely advocate for. I am less comfortable with things like milk drops or chocolate drops that are also manufactured, and I would advocate against that kind of thing for your rabbit. So absolutely go nuts with the natural type of treat, or the other ones. However, again, be mindful of things that are unlikely to be part of a natural diet for rabbits. And that is, you know, that's a treat for our human heads, not for that rabbit's digestion. So what about this link between diet and functionality in the rabbit? And I think we do need to have a very good understanding of this and to consider this as actually a really basic and fundamental concept. And it's a concept that we need to understand as veterinary staff, we need to understand as owners of rabbit companions, if you like. And I think it is the yin and the yang of rabbits. So if we consider rabbits over the millennia, they have evolved to thrive on a diet that is very fibrous and very nutrient dilute, which means they need to eat a lot and get out of it as much as they can. And they've formulated a strategy to actually directly address that, and they've become a very successful species in most cases. And if we look at sort of two of the key things that rabbits have used to deal with this diet, they have evolved constantly growing teeth so that they still have teeth to grind down this fibrous diet as they grow and age. They have also evolved a hindgut fermentation system that relies on both the grinding of the diet by the teeth as well as bacterial fermentation in the cecum. And this gives them a very responsive and reasonably efficient way of getting nutrition out of a nutrient dilute diet. It unlocks the potential of that diet. So this was a constraint during the rabbit's evolution, and what was a constraint has now become a requirement of our pet rabbits. And if we think about it, our pet rabbits need a high fiber diet so that these constantly growing teeth don't overgrow. And our rabbits need that high fiber diet to maintain the motility within their gut so that they don't suffer from gut stasis. So it's interesting, as I say, that what was an evolutionary constraint has now become a requirement of these animals as we keep them in captivity. So we need to absolutely understand that and apply that to how we feed these guys in order to maintain their bodies in good condition and to promote long and healthy life. So that brings me on to the importance of the microbiome to these hindgut fermenters. And I want to address what the microbiome actually is and what it does. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can manipulate it. So the microbiome is the sum of all of the viruses, the bacteria, the protozoa, the nematodes, the mites, the yeast, the fungi that are either on or within the rabbit's body. So just as much as there is a giant fermentation vat filled with billions of bacteria, viruses, yeast, protozoa in the cecum, there are also bacteria, yeasts, mites, etc. over the rabbit's skin as well. And all of these species together form the microbiome. The gut biome is where we rely on these bacteria, yeast, fungi, etc. for digestion, and these are an essential part of the jigsaw in terms of rabbits being able to unlock the nutritional potential from the very fibrous diet that we feed them. And as I've said previously, the gut biome is quite a responsive system. If you feed a rabbit with vegetable A, over a period of time, the biome will shift so that it can effectively digest vegetable A. It will respond to changes in diet as long as we are mindful about that, and it will respond negatively in some cases if we feed an animal inappropriately, or for example if inappropriate antibiotics are given. So it is very responsive, and it is responsible for the rabbit's ability to utilize very locked in nutrients from a fibrous diet. Now, this is not the biome's only function. And the one thing that I would absolutely emphasize at this stage is during the period of a rabbit's life, particularly when the rabbit transitions from generally being reliant on milk to being reliant on vegetation for its nutrition. So essentially going from being a very simple gutted animal to the complex hindgut fermenter that we're familiar with, the biome within the gut is intrinsically responsible for presenting antigens, so things that stimulate immune response, to the lymphoid tissue in the gut. And that presentation of antigen within the gut is what stimulates a rabbit's immunity, essentially allowing it in later life to respond appropriately to threat. So it's a really very vastly important system. So there are things that we can do to promote its health in terms of feeding. And the first thing is to feed an appropriate diet so that the bacteria within that system are as good as we can make them. We can also manipulate it in other ways. So we are looking at things like pre, pro, and postbiotics. Prebiotics are typically complex molecules that are included and found in some plants. So things like cellulose, hemicellulose, and inulin. So prebiotics can be added into kibble or assist feeding formulas. Prebiotics are also contained in things like endive or chicory. And again, if we include these as part of the rabbit's diet, then we can promote the addition of good bacteria within the biome. Probiotics are actually encapsulated appropriate bacteria that can be fed to a rabbit, and these again can be incorporated as supplements. They can be incorporated in assist feeding formulas. They can be incorporated in some forms of pelleted food as well, and these bacteria can safely cross the very acidic stomach of the rabbit and can actually survive and thrive to colonize part of the gut, again giving benefit to that animal. Postbiotics are the byproducts of bacteria, again that can promote well-being and the profile of good bacteria within the rabbit's gut. And all of these products, as I say, can be used to manipulate what we have as a biome, again to promote the health of the individual. So it's useful to consider these. So what happens when the lifestyle changes? What are we talking about in terms of this? So we're talking about age and life stages. Obviously, very young rabbits or rabbits that are breeding or lactating will need higher energy diets. They'll quite often need higher calcium levels, higher protein levels, whereas aging animals perhaps might need a reduced amount of calcium, fewer calories, but still a very good protein content. Neutering directly alters the energy requirement of an animal. So an animal that is neutered will need fewer calories, although perhaps its appetite won't change. So this is a key point at which an animal can become obese if we don't adjust how we feed it. So what do we change. So we can change the calcium content, the energy content, the protein content very typically. And what about other things? So I've put indoor versus outdoor rabbits here, and there is evidence to suggest that actually indoor rabbits would benefit from the addition of some vitamin D to the diet versus outdoor rabbits, where we can expect the outdoor rabbits to get vitamin D from direct sunlight. So again, it's worthwhile considering the lifestyle of the rabbit that you are feeding, and whether it does have direct access to sunlight, and its life stage in terms of, again, how we're physically going to feed it. Because what we want to do is to promote health and longevity with the diet as much as possible. So we can consider using components of the diet as medicine, if you like, and there are various ways that we can do this. Many foods have substances within them that convey a specific health benefit, and this can be within the whole food item. For example, things like cranberries. If your rabbit, cranberries can prevent bacterial adhesion in the bladder. So feeding cranberries or cranberry products can be helpful if your rabbit has cystitis, for example. We can also have food additives that have specific health benefits. Now, I am not talking prescription medication here. I am not talking antibiotics, but I am talking about things, for example, like glucosamine and chondroitin, that are commonly used food supplements that can have benefit in some cases for joint disease. As I said, things like cranberry extract can confer benefit for some animals that are experiencing urinary tract issues. Other things such as ginkgo biloba, ginseng, again, these can have benefits in terms of cardiovascular health or in terms of cognition, for example, in older animals. Other things that we can consider, perhaps as fresh items such as raspberry leaf or dandelion, these can promote diuresis, so they can be helpful in urinary tract disease to increase the amount of fluid that is actually going through the urinary tract. Things like parsley can affect breathing, so that can convey a benefit. Plants like mint can improve digestive health and can reduce levels of nausea. And I know rabbits can't vomit, but we do believe that they can experience nausea. So again, there's a variety of things that we could consider here in terms of trying to support specific conditions naturally, in addition to any medical benefit or medications that are prescribed. This is not instead of medication, it's supporting an animal that is diagnosed and properly treated. So what about using food in other ways? So absolutely, we can use food to encourage exercise, and a lot of pet rabbits, regardless of the space they have in their environment, I'm talking animals that do have adequate space, will still not necessarily interact with their environment unless they are encouraged. So we can use food as motivation for movement. Wild rabbits will usually spend hours foraging for food, eating it and digesting it, whereas quite often, unless we're a little bit more creative, pet rabbits might spend 5 minutes eating their allotted pellets, and then I think might need a little bit more encouragement to interact with their environment. So actually what we can do is look at things like scatter feeding or treat balls and that type of thing to encourage the animal to move around the environment to access food. And this actually improves their time budget. It improves how much they move. It makes conditions like hock sores, obesity, and urinary sludging much less likely. So again, scatter feeding is only the beginning, and we're limited only by our imagination here. And as an extension of that, we can use food as an enrichment. And enriching an animal's environment can be very simple. We can certainly do that within the veterinary hospital. We can certainly do that within the home environment. And it's an addition to an animal's captive environment of things that promote welfare and encourage them to display normal behaviours. And I think it's allowing these animals to, display normal behaviours and to have something to do while, they're moving around, gaining food, what have you. And the food here is the motivation. And you can see in this picture where we have a washing line with herbs pegged to it, and that encourages these animals to sit up on their hind legs, extend up to grasp these herbs. And the benefit for that animal is mobility, its muscle strength, its balance, all of these things that if you don't use, you lose. And as I say, it genuinely benefits the animals in the environment. And absolutely, we are only limited by our imagination here, and this can look as exactly how you want it to look. But I would encourage those of us in a veterinary environment, as well as those of us that have rabbits within our homes, to really get creative and to do some interesting things for our rabbits in terms of food enrichment. So that comes to the end of this kind of tour around why and how and what we should feed our rabbits. Thank you very much for listening, and I would encourage you all to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll be very, very happy to address these. Thank you very much indeed.